How dare you show up like this? You're deliberately trying to ruin my event. Margaret's voice echoed through the ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel, drawing attention from the elegantly dressed donors mingling nearby. I stood frozen, my hand still clutching my purse, as my mother-in-law stormed toward me in her designer gown. My name is Olivia Parker, and at 34, I never expected to be publicly humiliated at a charity gala meant to support children's education. But here I was, watching my mother-in-law's face turn an alarming shade of red as she pointed at my conservative black evening dress, the same one she had approved just last week. This is completely inappropriate. You're making a mockery of everything we stand for. Margaret hissed, grabbing my arm and practically dragging me toward the exit. I could feel the stares of hundreds of wealthy donors watching the scene unfold with a mix of shock and discomfort. The thing is, I knew exactly why Margaret was doing this. It had nothing to do with my dress and everything to do with what I had discovered in the ladies' room just 10 minutes ago. Let me back up a bit. I married James, Margaret's only son, 3 years ago. From day one, Margaret made it clear that I wasn't the daughter-in-law she had envisioned for her perfect family. I wasn't from old money, didn't belong to the right country clubs, and worst of all, I worked as a public school teacher instead of dedicating my life to charity luncheons and social climbing. But I had tried to make it work. God knows I had tried. When Margaret asked me to help with her annual education charity gala, I jumped at the chance. Maybe this would finally be my opportunity to prove I could fit into her world. For weeks, I stayed late after school, making phone calls to potential donors, organizing silent auction items, and doing whatever Margaret asked. I even used my connections in the education system to bring in real stories of children who had benefited from previous year's donations. The evening had started perfectly. The ballroom was stunning, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd of Boston's elite. The silent auction tables were beautifully arranged, and the presentation I had helped prepare about the charity's impact was ready to go. Then I excused myself to the ladies' room and overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear. Margaret was inside one of the stalls, speaking in hushed tones on her phone. "Don't worry, everything's going according to plan. Once we announce the new scholarship program, we can easily divert most of the funds through your foundation. These rich idiots won't even notice that their donations are being redirected. Yes, the paperwork shows it's all going to the children." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The charity, the one I had been working so hard to support, was apparently a front for something much darker. Margaret was planning to funnel the donations away from the children who desperately needed them. My hands shook as I quietly slipped my phone from my purse and hit record, capturing her continued conversation about fake paperwork and offshore accounts. I had barely managed to stop the recording and step away from the stall when Margaret emerged, her face going pale when she saw me. Now, as she practically shoved me toward the exit, I understood her panic. She wasn't worried about my dress being inappropriate. She was terrified I would expose what I had overheard. "Margaret," I said firmly, planting my feet, "you need to think very carefully about what you're doing right now." The crowd around us had grown larger, and I could see phones being raised, recording the scene. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into my arm. "Security, this woman is disrupting my event." As 2 security guards approached, I caught sight of James pushing through the crowd, confusion written across his face. "Mom, Olivia, what's going on?" Margaret turned to her son, tears suddenly appearing in her eyes. "James, darling, I'm so sorry, but your wife has had too much to drink. She's making a scene and saying horrible things about the charity. We need to remove her before she ruins everything we've worked for." I hadn't touched a drop of alcohol all evening, and James knew it. I could see the doubt creeping into his expression as he looked between us. "James," I said quietly, meeting his eyes, "I need you to trust me. What's about to happen next isn't what anyone expected, but it's necessary." I turned to address the now silent crowd of donors, and I believe everyone here deserves to know exactly what their generous donations are really funding. Margaret's face went from red to white in an instant. "Get her out of here, now," she screamed at the security guards. But it was too late. I had already pressed send on a text message, and throughout the ballroom, phones began to chime with an incoming email, the recorded conversation from the bathroom, along with copies of financial documents I had discovered while working on the presentation. The last thing I saw as the security guards escorted me out was Margaret's face contorting with rage as donors began pulling out their phones and whispers started spreading through the crowd. Sometimes being inappropriate means being exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. News of last night's gala meltdown had spread through Boston's elite social circles like wildfire. I sat at our kitchen table, watching James pace back and forth as he tried to process everything. "I just can't believe it," he kept saying, running his hands through his hair. "All those years, all those children who could have been helped." He stopped and looked at me, his eyes tired from a sleepless night. "How did you figure it out?" I pulled up the financial records on my laptop. During my weeks of helping with the gala, I had noticed small discrepancies in the charity's books. Nothing obvious at first, just numbers that didn't quite add up, scholarships that never seemed to reach their intended recipients. "Your mother got sloppy," I explained, turning the screen toward him. She was so convinced no one would question her that she barely tried to hide it. The scholarship foundation she was funneling money through. It's registered to her brother-in-law in the Cayman Islands. James sank into the chair across from me, looking devastated. All those speeches about helping underprivileged children, all those galas and fundraisers, it was all a lie. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Diana, Margaret's personal assistant. "Mrs. Parker, I need to talk to you. I have more documents. Can we meet?" I showed the message to James. He nodded slowly. "Diana's worked for Mom for 15 years. If anyone knows where the bodies are buried." An hour later, we met Diana at a quiet coffee shop across town. She looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder as she pulled files from her bag. "I've been keeping copies of everything," she whispered, sliding them across the table. "Every transfer, every fake scholarship, every administrative fee that went straight to offshore accounts." I wanted to say something, but Mrs. Harrison, she has a way of making problems disappear. Looking through the documents, my stomach turned. The charity scam went back years, possibly decades. Millions of dollars that should have gone to education programs had instead funded Margaret's lavish lifestyle. Her vacation homes, her business trips to exotic locations. "There's more," Diana continued, her voice shaking. "Last night, after you left, she had a complete meltdown. She started shredding documents in her office and making calls. I heard her telling someone to clean out the accounts before they could be frozen." James immediately pulled out his phone and started calling lawyers. While he stepped outside to talk, Diana leaned closer to me. "You should know, she's planning to blame everything on you. She's already telling people you were in charge of the finances, that you must have orchestrated the whole thing." I couldn't help but laugh. Me? The daughter-in-law she never let near any real responsibility. The one she constantly reminded didn't belong in her social circle. "I know," Diana nodded. "That's why I kept the real records, including all the times she specifically wrote that you were to be kept away from any financial decisions." By afternoon, the story had hit the local news. "Prestigious charity gala ends in scandal," read the headlines. My phone was flooded with messages from other teachers at my school, many sharing stories of students who'd been promised scholarships from Margaret's foundation, only to have them mysteriously fall through. Then came the call from Margaret herself. "You vindictive little witch," she snarled before I could even say hello. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I've spent 20 years building this reputation." "You mean 20 years stealing from children who needed help?" I kept my voice calm, recording the call just like I had in the bathroom. 20 years using their stories to fund your beach house in the Hamptons. "You're going to regret this," she threatened. "By the time I'm done, everyone will believe you were behind everything. The gold-digging teacher who married my son and tried to steal from charity. Who do you think they'll believe, me or you?" "Actually," I replied, "I think they'll believe the evidence. And the witnesses. How many people did you really think you could fool forever, Margaret?" She hung up, but I knew this wasn't over. Within hours, her version of events started circulating. Posts appeared on social media claiming I had manipulated the charity's books, that I had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to discredit her. But Margaret had made a crucial mistake. In her rush to point fingers, she'd forgotten about the dozens of society events where she had publicly belittled me, the countless witnesses to her making sure I was kept away from any real responsibility in the charity. More importantly, she'd forgotten about the people she had stepped on during her climb to social prominence. People who had been waiting years for a chance to expose her. By evening, our house had become an impromptu headquarters for people coming forward with their own stories. Former employees, disappointed donors, families who had been promised help that never materialized. Each person brought another piece of evidence, another account of Margaret's deception. James sat beside me through it all, quietly supportive as his mother's carefully constructed facade crumbled. "I should have seen it," he said at one point, his voice heavy with regret. All those times she said she was protecting the family's reputation, she was just protecting herself. Diana arrived again as night fell, carrying even more files. "She's on her way to the airport," she informed us. "Private jet to the Cayman Islands." But she smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "The FBI is already there waiting." I squeezed James's hand as we watched the news coverage of Margaret being escorted off her private plane in handcuffs, her perfectly coiffed hair wild, her designer dress wrinkled. All her careful planning, all her social climbing and manipulation had finally caught up with her. But amid the satisfaction of seeing justice served, my heart ached for the real victims, the children who could have been helped, the families who had pinned their hopes on false promises. As I watched Margaret's empire crumble, I was already planning how to make things right. This wasn't just about exposing a scandal anymore. It was about rebuilding something genuine from the ruins of Margaret's deception. And judging by the determined look in James's eyes, I wasn't alone in that mission. The real work was just beginning. The weeks following Margaret's arrest were a whirlwind of investigations, interviews, and revelations. The FBI's forensic accountants uncovered a web of fraud that stretched back even further than we'd initially thought. Margaret hadn't just been stealing from her own charity. She'd been running similar schemes through half a dozen charitable foundations across the country. Sitting in our living room, watching the national news coverage of her case, I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. The reporter detailed the full scope of her deception. Over $30 million meant for educational programs had been diverted to private accounts. And in a surprising turn of events, the reporter continued, her daughter-in-law, Olivia Parker, a public school teacher, has been instrumental in establishing a new foundation to help the families affected by this fraud. James squeezed my hand as we watched. After Margaret's arrest, we'd spent countless hours tracking down every student and family who had been promised help through her fake scholarship programs. It wasn't enough just to expose the fraud. We needed to make things right. The new Parker Education Foundation, the reporter explained, backed by many of the original donors and run with full transparency, has already begun distributing legitimate scholarships to students who were previously deceived. What the news didn't show were the late nights James and I had spent setting up proper oversight measures, the careful documentation of every dollar, and the partnerships we'd established with legitimate educational organizations. We were determined to create something honest from the ashes of Margaret's deception. Diana had become our head of operations, her years of detailed record-keeping now serving a genuine cause. "It's like therapy," she told me one day, fixing everything she broke. Margaret's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming, and her attempts to blame others only made things worse. When she tried to claim I had masterminded everything, her own recorded words from the Gala bathroom sealed her fate. The judge was particularly harsh in his sentencing. "Mrs. Harrison," he declared, "you didn't just steal money. You stole hope from children who had precious little to begin with. 20 years in federal prison seems barely adequate." As Margaret was led away in her orange jumpsuit, so different from her usual designer wear, she shot me one final glare. But I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only relief that she could no longer hurt anyone else. The real victory came 3 months later at the first legitimate scholarship ceremony of the Parker Education Foundation. Watching 20 students receive their college acceptance letters and guaranteed funding, seeing their parents' tears of joy, I knew we had created something meaningful. One mother hugged me tightly after the ceremony. My daughter had given up on college after what happened with the Harrison Foundation, she whispered. "You gave her her dreams back." James stood at the podium, addressing the gathered families and donors. "My mother taught me a lot about legacy," he said, his voice strong and clear, but not in the way she intended. "She showed me that true worth isn't in social status or bank accounts, it's in the lives we touch and the good we do. Today, we're starting a new legacy." The foundation grew beyond our initial hopes. Other donors, impressed by our transparency and genuine results, came forward with additional funding. We established mentorship programs, educational workshops, and support services for first-generation college students. A year after Margaret's arrest, I received an unexpected letter. It was from her, written from prison. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. Dear Olivia, it read, I still hate you for what you did to me. But I see the news about the foundation, about the lives you're changing. You've managed to build something I never could, something real. I suppose that's a better revenge than anything I could have planned. I showed the letter to James, who read it with a sad smile. She still doesn't get it, does she? He said. This was never about revenge. He was right. Standing in my classroom the next day, watching my students work, I thought about how different things might have been if Margaret had used her influence for good from the start. But dwelling on what ifs wouldn't help anyone. Instead, I focused on the future. The Parker Education Foundation was thriving, helping more students every year. James and I were expecting our first child, and I couldn't help but smile, thinking about the values we'd pass on: honesty, compassion, and the understanding that true wealth isn't measured in dollars. Margaret's inappropriate daughter-in-law had built something she never could: a legacy of genuine change and hope. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply doing what's right, no matter who tries to stand in your way. The final irony? The annual charity gala continues, now hosted in the same ballroom where Margaret once tried to have me throw him out. But these days, the only tears shed are those of joy, as we celebrate real achievements and genuine transformations in young lives. As they say, living well is the best revenge, but living honestly? That's even better.